Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session on Neuromatch Academy. I will be a facilitator for today, and today we're talking spiking activity. Okay, so for us to cover what we want to, we're first going to need to talk about neurons because these are the basic units of the nervous system. They underlie everything that the nervous system is able to do. And it's these neurons and their properties that allow action potentials. So we'll talk about the properties of action potentials and how we currently record them. Right? And then that will then lead us really into being able to discuss about the value or the role that these neurons and the spikes that they generate create when it comes to communicate within the nervous system. And lastly, we can then discuss the strengths and the limitations. Because as great as it is that we can record spikes, nothing is perfect in this world, so we'll talk about what limits it. Okay, so as I said, the neurons form the basic unit of the nervous system, and they are what allows communication within the system, and it all happens via electrical signals. Electrical signals getting bounced around from one neuron to the next. And these neuron that we can see here, a stereotypical image of a neuron, have dendrites that, just collect electrical signals and bring it in towards the cell body. The cell body is here, also called soma. And it's the sum of all the activity that comes in from these dendrites that will then trigger the generation of an action potential here at the base known as the axon hillock. And then the action potential will then be, propagated along the axon all the way to the axon terminals, where you have these synapses. Here, neurotransmitters are released, then trigger another electrical signal in an adjacent neuron. Okay, so this will be on the dendrites, ideally, of an adjacent neuron. Okay, now the first thing to talk about, even before we reach action potentials, are these other types of potentials called graded potentials. They are basically electrical signals that can be of various intensities, as you can see in the graph here. So when the dendrites are sort of like collecting information into the soma, what they're doing is summing up, various bits of graded potentials. And if the sum of all these graded potentials exceeds a certain point, it's able to then trigger an action potential. Okay. So now on to our action potentials, or spikes, as we like to say. Well, simply, we can call them a rapid change in the polarity of the membrane potential. Now, that's why a number of few words over there. So bear with me right now, and I'll try and put that across to you. So, first thing is, we know that these cells have a membrane. Okay, and this is the extracellular space and then the intracellular space. Now, I've indicated here that there's a differential distribution of ions on either side of the membrane. Okay. What that means is that the sum of all the ions you have in the external space is different from what you have in the external space. So, for example, if you were to add up all the ions on the external space and subtract it from the ions on the internal space, you end up with a situation where the external space is more positively charged than the internal space. And this differential creates a gradient and a potential difference, which when the neuron isn't doing much, we say is minus 70 millivolts. Now that's great. That's the first thing to make note of. And you also need to make note of the fact that there are channels within this membrane which allow selected ions to pass in and out of the cell as they need to. On the outside of the external space, one of the main ions that's there is sodium, whereas on the inside, one of the main ions is potassium, and they almost have equal amounts. So what I've put here is that, for the action potential, you have a first part of it, which is an influx of sodium ions. So sodium ions coming into the cell and with it bringing a positive charge, so that now the inside of the cell becomes more positively charged compared to the outside. But shortly after that, you have an efflux of potassium ions, which is to say the potassium ions leave the cell and take with it their positive charge. Okay, so what then happens is that the inside becomes negative again, and this is what is that rapid flip in the polarity I mentioned. So allow me to draw another graph similar to what we saw for the greater potentials before. Okay, and on the graph we'll put time in milliseconds over here, and then we'll put amplitude in millivolts over here. And we said when the neuron isn't doing much, we have this minus 70 millivolts point. Okay. And I'd mentioned that the greater potentials, when they exceed a certain point, then you get your action potentials. And that point is typically put at minus 55 millivolts. Okay. So the reason we say action potentials are all or nothing, as I've indicated here, right, is because once you exceed that minus 55 point, the consequence is always the same. It's a very stereotypical positive upstroke all the way to about plus 30 millivolts, and then a return back to where we are. So what does that look like? Well, let's take a resting point. There's some memory potential we're recording. Some form of stimulus could have come in. It didn't reach threshold, so it will come back down, right? The memory potential comes back down. But, maybe there was a number of different stimuli that came in and then they built up on each other. And once we hit this threshold point, okay, so that's our threshold. Once we hit this threshold point, you get a stereotypical influx of sodium, efflux of potassium, fall below resting, and then a return to our resting memory potential. And there is our action potential. That's why we say it's all or nothing. And the analogy I'd like you to think about is like flushing of toilets. You could start flushing the toilet, and maybe you didn't crank it firm enough, so a little bit of water will go into the chamber and it will just stutter, right? Like it wouldn't fully flush. But if you were to crank it hard enough, enough water in, then stereotypical response follows. There'll be the water will gush into the pot, there'll be a refill, and then you can start all over again. It no longer matters how firmly you cranked it, so long as you pass a certain threshold, the sequence or mechanism engages and it's very stereotypical. Another property or great thing about this analogy is that it also helps us talk about a sort of like refractory period which these action potentials have. That is to say, from one action potential to the next, there always has to be a time delay. Just as from one flush of the toilet to the next, there will be a time delay, a series or a time difference between them, so that there will be a maximum number of times you can flush your toilet in a minute. In the same vein, there'll be a maximum number of times you can have an action potential in any given minute. And think about, how that translates into, for example, how quickly you can move your fingers, right? I can do this slowly and increase the speed, but at some point I will hit a maximum speed that cannot go anymore. And part of that reason is because there's a maximum frequency that I can send signals to the muscles of my fingers to wiggle them around like that. Okay, so now let's talk about recording them. Right. So the first thing is that these we're recording their spikes from neurons, and the electrical activities are very small in nature. So you can put on some form of conducting metal or electrode. Some are glass pipettes with a fluid in it, and then a conducting metal. But it need to be amplified because these signals are so small. And once it's amplified, it can then be digitized, and then some form of acquisition units to help interpret it all together. Okay. So the spikes that we record, each activity will be, the action potentials that are being generated by an individual neuron. So you'll be recording activity from an individual neuron. And all the vital information that you need will be based on the frequency and firing pattern. Unlike the graded potentials that had like different intensities and durations, your action potentials have a set intensity, right? Minus 70 to plus 30, and a set duration, which is about 2 to 4 milliseconds. So it is within the firing pattern and the frequency of these potentials that certain pieces of information is coded or hidden in between. And that is where, there's a need to sort of sort out the data and make sense of it all. So let's talk about these properties, how they relate from the neurons onto the spikes. We've already said that there needs to be some form of threshold that is reached. Great. Now, the voltage gated channels are the ones that will be allowing the sodium ions into the cell and then the potassium ions out of the cell. So they are also very important. So now let's look at how these properties come together to really help us make sense of our spikes. So we've already said that some threshold needs to be reached before you get a spike. We've mentioned you have these channels that will need to allow sodium to come into the cell and potassium out of the cell. And we've also mentioned that each neuron will have a maximum sort of firing frequency. Now, I'm going to throw in another sort of variable into the mix, which is to say you can have some channels that don't necessarily open and close in response to a stimuli. They're sort of leaky, right? Like you have a leaky tap, which will always allow some amount of water to just drip out. In the same way, you can have these leaky channels that always allow some amount of positive ions to come into the cell. What this means is over time, they can eventually trigger an action potential. And I'll draw that up for us to look at. So, for example, let's draw our graph here again. Okay, and I'm going to draw two separate ones. So once again, we put time in milliseconds. Okay, and amplitude in millivolts. All right. And there's a starting point of minus 70 and then a threshold point of minus 55. Okay, now if you take the case of these leaky channels, it means that the memory potential could be, down there, but then slowly over time it will just be depolarizing until it reaches this threshold, right? Then boom, we kick in with our action potential. Great. Now, imagine if we can then artificially trigger these action potentials. What it then means is that we're able to then study the various firing frequencies and firing patterns. So let's consider, having sort of like action potential, but then we'll draw it on a different scale. Okay, and consider over here where we can then just have a neuron, okay, is going to hit threshold and then you get an action potential and then you sort of come back and we stop stimulating it and it comes down. So this will be, one spike that's fired in a neuron. Now, if we then stimulate it a bit more, we can start seeing different patterns, okay? So, for example, you can have a neuron that has a high activity at the start and then it dies out. You can have a neuron that, once it hits threshold, it will fire a series at a certain regular frequency. And once you turn it off, it goes. Or you can have, various intensities of frequencies. Okay, so something much more rapid. The point is, you can have an array of responses from different types of neuron based on what stimulation you give it. And all the properties of the neuron is what will dictate the sort of responses you'll get. And the last important thing, right, is that all these electrical properties of the neuron are subject to change. And here's what I mean. We can relate a neuron's activity to an external stimuli. Okay? And this can even change in health and disease. So let's start with relating to external stimuli. In this case, there are certain neurons in the visual system which are able to trigger their activity based on what we call their receptive fields, what's happening in their receptive fields. And the receptive fields are really just, a real world location where activity in there corresponds to a specific sort of like mapping within the visual system. Okay, so in this case, you can have certain cell types that within the area of external space where they respond to stimuli, they respond differently whether the light or the stimuli is presented within the center of their receptor field, as we see in the yellow dot here, or within the periphery of their receptor fields. So in this type of cell that's shown here on the left, when stimulus or light is shown in the center of its receptor field, it rather increases the spiking activity. And if you show it to its periphery, whether a little bit in its periphery or a lot in its periphery, it rather hinders or reduces its firing activity. And if you can have a cell type that behaves like this, you can then have the opposite, right? One that rather reduces activity if you have light in the center of its receptor field, and then increases activity when you have light in the periphery of its receptor field. So their properties change. They've been almost like inbuilt with slightly different properties, which means they can behave differently. That also means that whether it's a healthy neuron or a disease state, or there's some deficit in it, they can behave differently as well. Like here's an example of spikes that are recorded in the auditory system. Okay, and in this case, the cells they have they can fire a regular low frequency spiking, but then if you really increase the stimulation, you can get really a high frequency firing, like we see here, right? Each of these black lines represents a spike. Now you notice that in the disease states, even if you give it the same sort of stimulation, these spikes look a little bit different. They are not as regular as the normal one. In the same vein, their maximum firing frequency seems to be, not as impressive as the normal state. So it clearly suggests that in the disease state, some function has changed, which is then influencing how that neuron behaves. Now, we can then take this a bit further because one of the things that the nervous system is famous for is how plastic it is. Okay, it can change in response to previous activity. And that previous activity can include sort of like effects of drugs that can affect the neuron. It can also include, any manipulations that are made to its properties. And some of this could be due to experience. Think about learning. Think about memory. Think about the fact that even if you do not remember that you've seen an item before, if it's shown to you again, you can almost, recognize it and be like, wait, hang on, I think I've seen this before. Or you get maybe the sense of deja vu, right? That's because there are some neurons in there that their properties have changed ever so slightly after your first experience with the item. So that when you experience the item again, when you see it or you engage with it again, it's able to, trigger certain activity to let you know that I've seen this before. Okay, now this is where it gets on the whole next level because we can then connect each individual neuron to another one, and their varying properties that are subject to change can then also affect the whole network. So the simplest connection you can get for an excitation, where we say activity or an action potential in neuron A will then, cause the release of neurotransmitters and eventually trigger an action potential in neuron B. Easy. Now let's connect it with three. Activity in neuron A will trigger activity in neuron B. However, neuron B is an inhibitory neuron. What that means is that it rather prevents activity in which other neuron is sort of connected to. So in this case, we end up with this neuron rather being silenced. Okay, now let's add some feedback mechanisms into it, where you can have activity in neuron A, it will cause activity in neuron B, which was an inhibitory neuron, right? So the activity in neuron C will rather tend to silence neuron A. So, it's like, well, the A that started the whole process sort of shot himself in the foot, then he and rather gets silenced. And we can flip that around where activity in A causes activity in B, causes activity in C, and that just, excites A a whole lot more and feeds the cycle. And these networks are the sort of things that you will see in, your body clock, right? You're able to have cycles within the body that change between day and night, or your menstrual cycle, the neurons that will trigger the release of the egg within the ovaries and so on, follow a certain cycle that's based on connecting these different types of neurons and their properties, right? So if you consider that some of these will have endogenous bursting, so that will be, for example, those that have your leak channels that will, just naturally over time just give you some activity out of nowhere. And then those properties can come together into some of what we call central pattern generators, because I'm sure by now you're imagining, well, combinations can be put together and then they can then create, self-perpetuating systems that once you initiate them, a set sort of pattern of maybe even movements occurs. And this is what we see in a person's gait. Once you start walking, everything seems to sort of follow a certain rhythm. All right, let's talk drawbacks. Well, record spikes is a bit of a specialist skill. Requires a lot of training, but thankfully, it's quite a bit of it is getting sort of like automated these days. Next, you're only able to record activity from one cell, so you miss out on everything else that's happening around that one cell or in its network. Of course, you can record from multiple single cells at a time, let's say 5 cells, 8 cells, but you still only getting one activity and you miss out a holistic picture. The other thing is that each cell is plastic. Okay, it's subject to change its properties, and the network that it's in is also subject to change. So the intervention of you even recording from the cell, it cannot be ruled out what sort of like influence or impact that has on the activity and the properties of the cell. Fourthly, the longevity of the cells. Cells are notorious for dying out on you when you need them to stay alive a bit longer. Because bear in mind, you are disturbing the cell by, sticking an electrode in it or really disrupting its membrane. So some cells may be able to stay viable for a long time, others die out quickly. The quality or the veracity of the recordings that they are giving you, can be questionable if you are in there for too long and you are changing their properties. And lastly, if you get everything right and everything goes well, the amount of data that can be generated can be huge. And then there's a need to sort of sort it all out and make sense of it. And here also there are some automated and processes or even personal programs that people write to help them sort out all the data. All right, so let's put it all in summary. So we say neurons are the basic unit of the nervous system, and the spikes are sort of like their outputs. Now, the properties of the neuron will give rise to various spike patterns, some of which has been shown on the left here. Also, the properties are subject to change. It's not fixed. And thirdly, the connection within the neurons can give birth to a multitude of possibilities of how they relate with one another. But most importantly, what I would like to leave with you after this session, and you should always bear this with you, is that if you can think of a certain mechanism or series of connections within networks of neurons, it probably exists. If it hasn't been shown yet, it's up to you to do so. Okay, thank you for your time.